welcome to In the Know. I'm your host, Emily Nuevo. We've all heard these familiar phrases before. All carbs are bad for you, sweetener is better than sugar, and juice is healthier than coffee. Well, tonight we are talking all about these misconceptions and debunking major health myths. So joining me tonight is certified nutritionist Shannon Kadlovski. Shannon, you've been on the show before, so welcome.
Thank you.
Back.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am really excited about this show tonight because I'm going to have all my questions answered, that is, because we're talking all about misconceptions when it comes to health and to foods,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
So let's get started.
Okay.
What's the first myth?
Okay. So the first myth is that all carbohydrates are bad for you, and I hear it all the
Yeah,
time.
that's a major one.
The truth about that is that not all carbohydrates are bad, and that we actually need complex carbohydrates in our diet for fiber and for energy. So the whole idea is that we want to stay away from, I mean, it is true, there are some carbs that are bad for you, but we want to stay away from the ones that are sort of refined and white. So what happens when, when you have, let's say, a whole grain and it's been refined, they remove the bran and the germ from that grain, which is the part that gives us the fiber, and they polish that grain with glucose, which is sugar, and then you end up with this sort of nutrient void, not beneficial whatsoever grain. Those are the bad ones. So those are the ones that we definitely want to stay away from in our diet. But there are ones that we do need to have in our diet to give us that fiber, to give us that sustained energy to get through the day, to make us feel fuller. And those are, some of the examples that I have here are things like quinoa, oats, and other whole grains, brown rice, buckwheat, whole wheat. Those types of things are the ones that we want to have in our diet.
So just to be clear, foods like quinoa and buckwheat, like
Yes.
you just mentioned, they are carbs. They are carbs, but they're the good carbs.
Exactly. So there's good carbs and bad
okay.
carbs, right? So those are the good ones that we want to have in our diet.
Here's another question, though, for you, because this is what I've been always curious about. Fruits and vegetables.
Yes.
Are they carbs? And if they're supposed to be good for us, then should we be consuming a lot of those, even though they are carbs? Like that's sort of the
that's the whole thing, right? So
gray
that's
area.
the myth, is that not all carbs are bad for us, right? So the fruits and vegetables, yes, they break down in our system. They are carbohydrates, but the whole idea is that we want to choose the carbohydrates that break down slower. So the reason that some carbohydrates, like the refined ones, are bad for us, like the white rice and white pasta and all that, is because they break down really much quicker in our system than the whole grains. And so they cause blood sugar spikes much quicker. So those are the ones we want to avoid. But the fruits and vegetables, they're the ones that are good for us. So it's okay to have lots of fruits and vegetables in our diet.
even though they're carbs.
Even though they're carbs.
Okay.
So the other thing with the carbs is that when you're choosing products that say whole grain on them, because we want to include those whole grains in our diet, you have to be very careful that you're actually choosing true whole grains and not just products that sort of put them on their label to entice you to want to buy them.
So is the bread an example of that?
So the bread's an example of that. Yeah, so when you're buying a bread, you want to buy one that says 100% whole grain, or look on the ingredients list and see if the first or only ingredient is a whole grain.
So what does this say,
So
Shannon?
this one says made with whole grains. So it makes you think that it's a healthy item, right?
Yes.
In fact, it's not. All that means is that somewhere on the ingredients list, probably not first or even second, there's some whole grains thrown in there. So they make you think that it's a healthy product when it's really not a true whole grain product, right? So the quinoa, for example.
Yeah, but, so because going back to this though, this looks somewhat healthy to me. It's
Right.
brown, it says made with whole grains, but no,
But
you
no,
wouldn't recommend this.
I definitely wouldn't, because it's not a true whole grain.
It's not a true whole
So
grain.
you want to look for things, these Mary's crackers here, all the ingredients are just pure whole grains. There's nothing sort of else added, and the first, second, third, fourth ingredient, they're all whole grains. So you want to
really look at the ingredients list.
Don't just read the labels. Don't be enticed by the labels. Really look at the ingredients and make sure that you see that true whole grain, whether it's whole wheat, whole rice, whole oats. Make sure that that's the first ingredient.
Okay, that makes sense, because we all know, marketing schemes will say made with, has, includes.
Exactly.
But it may not be 100% true, 100% natural.
Exactly.
And
So
we'll get into the organic and natural myth later on in the show.
Yeah.
But okay, so stay away from the refined carbs.
Yes. Stay away from the refined stuff. The other things that we want to include, so we want to include the whole grains, which are the good source of carbohydrate. And we also want to include things like legumes and starchy vegetables, which are also carbohydrates, but good for us carbohydrates. So things like squash, sweet potatoes, corn, chickpeas, lima beans, those kinds of foods are carbohydrates, but they're, again, the good ones.
Can we just go back to legumes? For people who don't know what those are, because I think they're vegetables. Are they?
They're sort of the beans.
They're the beans.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're just the beans, like the lima beans like you mentioned. Okay.
Yeah. So those are the ones that we want to include. So we can't be afraid of carbohydrates as sort of a general category of food. You never want to completely eliminate carbohydrates from your diet. Lots of bad things start to happen when we totally remove an entire food group. But when you're looking at carbohydrates, choose the whole grains, the starchy vegetables, and the legumes, and stay away from the refined stuff, and you're good.
And when you say refined, you mentioned earlier in the show, any white, starchy, like the actual color, like the white pasta, stay away from?
Stay away from the white
pasta. Go to the brown.
Exactly,
Oh,
exactly.
Okay. So that's literal.
And the sugary foods, the cakes, the candies, those are all carbohydrates. They have lots and lots of sugar in them, so those are the ones we want to stay away from as well.
Okay, that might be hard for me to stay away from that. But let's go to the second myth.
Okay. So the second myth is that fat makes you fat. Eating fat makes you fat. And the truth is that we actually need fat to lose fat, right? And so again, the same way with carbs, you can't generalize the entire category of fats. There are good fats and there are bad fats.
This is what I've heard. There are actually good fats that you can consume in your diet and you're not going to become overweight or you're not. Okay.
So the good fats actually help to reduce inflammation. They help to promote weight loss. They help our hair, skin, and our nails. They help promote proper brain function. They do a whole lot of things for our body. We need to have those good fats in our diet. And we'll talk about what they are in a second. But the thing to remember is that there are bad fats. So yes, consuming a lot of the trans and saturated fats aren't good for us. So those are the ones that we want to avoid. So when you're looking, or when you're choosing a product, staying away from some, you can find a lot of saturated fat in animal products and dairy. And so trying to not have too much of that in your diet, too much red meat, too much, dairy in your diet is going to help.
Those have fats in it?
Saturated fats in them.
Saturated fats.
Yes.
Red meats.
Yeah. And
okay, because I'm thinking red meats, that's where you get your iron.
Well, you do, but you can also get your iron from a lot of leafy green vegetables as well. There are a lot of non-animal sources of iron that we don't need to have too much of that in our diet. Okay, and those items are also high in cholesterol. So we also want to avoid the trans fats. And those are the ones that, if you look at a label and you see hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils, you know that's a trans fat. And there's actually no safe level of trans fat. We don't need to have any of that in our diet. We can totally remove that entire category of fat as long as we make sure we have the good fats. So
so good fats and bad fats, as we learned about this myth. And when we come back, more about uncovering health myths. Stay tuned. Welcome back to In the Know. Tonight we're talking all about health myths and misconceptions about health and foods. So Shannon, before the break, we were talking about fats and how there are good fats and bad fats. So what do you want to wrap up about that point?
So we talked about some of the bad fats to stay away from, but to talk about some of the good fats, we want to make sure that we're having things like salmon, nuts and seeds, so flax seeds that we have here.
See, I've heard so many good things about flax seeds. So talk a little bit about it, because it looks like it's kind of ground up in this package here.
These ones actually are the whole seeds, but when you use flax seeds, you want to use them ground. So you can buy them whole and grind them yourself, or you can buy them ground and store them in the fridge. They're amazing for our digestion. They're a really good source of the omega fats for us that we want. So it's really beneficial. Even a tablespoon or two per day, I put it in my oatmeal or granola or whatever it is that I'm eating. You can really put it on anything. If you're using something like this, which is the flax oil, this one you don't want to cook with. So it gives us that same benefit of having the flax, but we don't want to cook with it because it'll go rancid. So it's
so if you just hold it up there, to me it seems like it says oil in it. I'm going to be heating up the pan and putting it on.
So there are certain oils that we want to cook with and certain oils that we want to stay away from. So the ones that we want to cook with are the more stable ones, things like coconut oil, grapeseed oil. Those are okay to cook with. Things like the hemp oil, the flax oil, and the olive oil, those should not be cooked with.
How do you eat them, or how do you?
So you can,
cook?
if you make a salad, you can use it as in your salad dressing, or you can
okay.
use it on top of a dish that you've made to top something, but you don't want to cook with it. Olive oil you can cook up to about a medium heat, but you don't want to overheat the olive oil either.
And how does it taste like the flaxseed? I've never had the actual oil, the
It's
flaxseed
sort of
oil.
light, nutty tasting
Oh,
oil.
okay.
Yeah, it's very light, and it's a much healthier choice than something like a Crisco or a shortening or something like that.
Really fatty,
So those are the
right?
hydrogenated ones that we want to stay away from, and things like avocados and nuts and seeds, like I mentioned, those are the good ones. So yeah,
Okay.
option.
So when we come back from break, more on uncovering health myths. Stay tuned.